This is the lecture for Derek Parfit's article, Personal Identity. It's probably better to watch this after you read the article, but you can watch it before if you want. Only the very last point about relation R. That's the only one that's going to have to sort of do directly with stuff you've read, and you can maybe even understand that before you read the article. But I recommend watching this lecture after. But it's well, whatever. Okay, so first point, split brains and thought experiments. So you'll notice when you read this article, or you'll notice when you read the article, if you already did, he's got a sort of thought experiment where we imagine we split your brain in two and we put one half in one body and one half in another body. And sometimes people complain like, that's not, and in the way Parfit tells it, we've duplicated you. There's two of you now. I mean, that's not quite accurate. And if you've read the article, in fact, that's completely inaccurate. But it's as if we've cloned you basically. And so sometimes people complain, look, the two halves of my brain are not identical. My left brain handles the right hand side of my body and some other stuff, and then my right brain handles the left hand side of my body and then some other stuff, and but they handle like different stuff. I don't know, language is over here or whatever, and other stuff is over here, whatever. And so the way Parfit tells it, where they're sort of identical, that's not going to work. So there's three things to keep in mind here. One is this thing I should have found uh, before I started talking about this, which I think he mentions uh, somewhere in a footnote or very briefly, but which he may not even mention at all. But it doesn't matter if he doesn't mention it. So first is that apparently in some people, they do have like strange brains where the two halves are sort of identical. Like the brain shares everything between the two halves, and so like the right half does everything and the left half does everything. So there are some people where you can split the brain and it's sort of as if you've doubled them. So that's just like imagine this is about one of those people. The second point is that um, like ultimately the point Parfit is trying to communicate in his mind doesn't actually depend on it like literally you don't like have to literally split the brain. You could like grow a clone of your brain and then put that in a body and then put your original brain in another body and you sort of get the same result. Like there were two of you walking around now, and for Parfit's purposes this illustrates the point just as well. So um that's not like a perfect like altered thought experiment. It's not perfect because of course people who think we're identical to our brains are going to say, well, a clone brain is not good. I'm identical to this brain, not a clone brain. Or maybe they won't. I don't know. It's complicated. But like so it's not a perfect one for one duplicate. And you can think back to the Williams article to understand why it's not a perfect one for one duplicate. But for most of the points Parfit is trying to illustrate, it still is a good illustration. And of course, nobody's going to argue that a clone of a brain is going to be like different than the original brain. We're just assuming we can clone the brain perfectly. So if you have problems with like the left and right brain being different, and you don't want to just imagine it's one of these people where the left and right brain are the same, you can, for most of the stuff Parfit is trying to prove, you can just imagine it's a clone brain. So now we have two brains, one a clone and one the original, rather than a split brain. Again, it's not perfect, but that will hopefully clear some stuff up. And then third, this is not to like, if you don't like the thought experiment, if you think it's just too weird or it's not good or something, I'm not trying to like shut that down entirely. Like people have issues with the thought experiment. The most famous is I think the title of the book is Real People, something like that. So Kathleen Wilkes is a philosopher, and she wrote a book. Again, I think it's called Real People or something like that, where she says, no, this split brain stuff, it's all a mess. Like that, none of it makes sense. So this is not to say you have to be happy with what Parfit is doing here, but this is just when you're reading and when you're trying to understand a philosopher, you want to sort of do your best to make it make sense. And so this is giving you tools to help it make sense. I'm not telling you it absolutely must make sense. Like when you make up your mind about it, like fine, you can reject it eventually, but work hard to try to make it make sense in your mind. And if you're having trouble with left and right being different, this will help you get over that, hopefully. Second, so this is the section of the class where we're reading about psychological theories of personal identity, and then also we're going to get sort of directly into the ethical issues related to personal identity, which we haven't talked about very much yet. And we're reading Parfit as a psychological theorist of personal identity. But as you'll notice, or as you may have noticed when you were reading it, he's not technically a psychological theorist about personal identity. Technically, he's a psychological theorist about personal identity in certain situations. And in fact, this is basically question 10 on the reading quiz. Question 10 on the reading quiz is basically asking you, like, when is Parfit a psychological theorist of personal identity, or about what situations is Parfit a psychological theorist of personal identity, or something like that. And so sometimes he's a psychological theorist about personal identity, and sometimes he's not. Sometimes he's saying something else. And if you look at the first paragraph, the first two paragraphs of the article, he says, we can, I think, describe cases in which, though we know the answer to every other question, we have no idea how to answer a question about personal identity. These cases are not covered by the criteria of personal identity that we actually use. Do they present a problem? And the thought is no. Like, so this is a long paragraph, but it basically says no. Like, no, it's not a problem if we somehow have a case, if we exist in a case where there's no answer to our question about personal identity. And that is, like, that's a strange claim, that like the claim that there could be a case where it's not really clear whether or not you exist, but you know, is no big deal, no sweat, don't worry about it. And the idea that, you know, there can be cases where you don't exist, but that's fine. That's not really like a psychological theory of personal identity or something. That's saying don't worry about personal identity. It doesn't matter. Like, personal identity doesn't matter. It's not what matters. And in fact, Parfit, as you will see, or you have seen in this article, he talks about sort of what matters. And his main thesis really is that personal identity is not always what matters. And so it's sort of like, really, personal identity is never what matters. What matters is something else. And so when you're saying stuff like this, when you say, look, personal identity is not what matters, there are cases where there's nobody identical to you, but that's okay. When you're saying that, you don't sound like a psychological theorist. You sound like a no-self theorist. So a no-self theory of personal identity says something like there is no such thing as personal identity. That's not quite Parfit's view. He thinks psychological theories are correct much of the time. So often there is such thing as personal identity. Often there is a person who is identical to you. You exist. But sometimes you don't exist, or there could be cases where you don't exist, but that would be fine for you. And that sort of very weird idea, that's an idea that is very close to, or basically is something that a no-self theorist would say. A no-self theorist of personal identity says there's no such thing as the self. So, you know, there's no reason to be worried about the self existing because the self does not exist. There is no, you are not identical to anybody because you do not exist. And so there are cases where you do not exist, Parfit thinks, and those are fine for you. And so being fine with that sort of thing, nobody else is fine with that. Other, like, the bodily theorist of personal identity is not fine with a case where your body goes away. You're dead. A narrative theorist of personal identity is not fine with the case where the narrative goes away, because then you're dead. The animalist theory of personal identity is not okay with a case where the animal goes away, because you're dead. Parfit, meanwhile, is okay with some cases where you're gone, you don't exist. He says that's fine. Like, technically you're dead, but he says it's just as good as survival. So that's strange, and that's basically a no-self view, or something like a no-self view. It's like, you don't exist in those cases, but it's fine. So trying to figure out where, I was about to say, sorry. So it's not hard to figure out where Parfit is between the psychological theories and the no-self theories. Again, question 10 is basically, when is Parfit a psychological theorist? And then the other cases are he's a no-self theorist. But it's interesting to think about, like, what does this mean for like the correct theory of personal identity, or is there one, or how do we think about that? So whatever. And then finally, again, if you're watching this before the reading, this is the one that'll maybe make a bit more sense after the reading. But so when Parfit talks about like what matters uh, throughout the thing, and like when he talks about, you know, here's what can stick around even when personal identity goes away, and you're still good to go. He doesn't he doesn't use this phrase in this article, but he uses it later in a book he writes about the same stuff. He calls this like relation R. He uses relation R to describe the sort of the relationship that matters between somebody in the past and somebody right now, which is the thing that matters. Like what matters for Parfit, he just says, let's give it a label, let's call it relation R. And that's just a shorthand for what he describes in this article. And you'll notice he thinks it's continuity and connectedness. And if you've read the article, you know what those are. If you haven't, you'll find out. So relation R is a shorthand, and I mentioned this because later, I think in 2 readings or 3 readings or next reading, whatever, at some point this is going to come up again, and so this is just to prepare you. The reading will explain it, and in fact it explains it pretty well. That's why I picked that reading, but it never hurts to go in prepared. So if you can start thinking about Parfit referring to what matters in terms of relation R, that will help you be ready for the future.